So we're on, maybe a minute. I've got a minute early, but we'll go ahead and get started. Okay. Your satellite and my satellite don't agree. So, but anyway, we'll go ahead and start because I'm going to start with a promo advertisement to begin with. Some of you have probably seen the announcement on the Facebook BACC members page. But for a number of months, we've been meeting before on Wednesday night and having dinner before class. And due to travel plans and people being in and out, we've suspended that until June. And I want to start it up again in June. And would like to encourage, we've got, another 10,000 meals we've got to add to marbles we've got to add. So we got to get eating. One change we're going to make when we start up in June is we're going to move the time from 6 to 6:15. And that'll give us plenty of time to eat because we were finishing up early. And may give some of you that are coming home from work, maybe you're online with us and you just can't quite get here, maybe another 15 minutes, give you a chance to come and join us. It's bring your own, everything from grab a sandwich, grab a protein bar, to leftovers, to stop and get something. But we just meet and have a little fellowship before we come into class. And so I would encourage you to watch for announcements about when we're going to start that back up in June and come join us. So I have good news and I have bad news for you. The good news is I'm not Tim Stutzman. Okay? I have not taken over this class. Okay? He has not abandoned this class to me. The bad news, I am not Tim Stutzman. Okay? And you're stuck with me for tonight. I don't know where he is. I don't know what he's doing. But he said he wouldn't be here and asked me to fill in for him, which I'm happy to do. First two classes have been great. I hope we appreciate just the good teachings and the sermons that he brings us on Sunday. If you do any traveling around, you come to appreciate and recognize what a treasure and what a blessing we have in the lessons that he brings to us. So as we start the lesson tonight, he said, well, I think we're done with chapter 13 and you can go on into 14. And I got to looking and he's not done with 13, okay? He thought he was done with 13. But also I want to back up and pick up a few things. We were out of town and I had to watch last week's online, and there were a couple of things that I'd wanted to say then that I get a chance to say tonight because I got the mic. But things that I think will hopefully fill in some gaps, I think maybe that are there, and maybe bring a little bit different flavor to some of the things we've talked about that also relate to the things that we'll be looking at later on tonight. But I want to begin by talking about Shakespeare. Okay, I don't know what kind of Shakespeare folks you are. Well, I am not a Shakespeare expert. I am fairly familiar with Romeo and Juliet. I have a passing familiarity with Hamlet. I know a little bit about King Lear. Can generally on Jeopardy recognize a Shakespearean quote. But I bring it up because when you start reading writings about 1st and 2nd Samuel, you will find folks comparing this story and this narrative that we're looking at to a Shakespearean tragedy. And Macbeth, not any particular, but just in general, the way that the characters are developed, they're not one-dimensional. The folks are not all good and all bad and they only act in the same way. They're like us. They do good things, they do bad things, they do stupid things, they do spiritual things. But I want to suggest to you that's wrong, and that's the wrong perspective to have. And I'm backed up by a fellow by the name of Jerry Rushford. I don't know if any of you recognize his name. He's a longtime professor at Pepperdine. He's been retired for a few years. Intriguing guy, interesting guy. He was a friend of Howard Hughes. Howard Hughes' family included members of the Church of Christ. And he tells this fascinating story about meeting him, and then out of the blue months later, Howard Hughes sending him a wedding present. Just fascinating story. He also was a hymnologist. I'm not sure if hymnologist is a word. He was a musicologist, in particular a collector and an expert on Christian hymns and their origins, which, that obviously attracts me to him. When you go to Pepperdine, there's actually a wing of the library called the Rushford Wing. That's all his collected writings and hymns and whatever from 40 or 50 years worth of work. And he made the claim that this was, at the time, it was over 40 years. I'm sure it's now over 50 years. That in 50 years of preaching, he never preached a sermon that he didn't incorporate the lyrics from a Christian hymn into it. So maybe I got a goal tonight. But he was a fairly regular speaker at the Spiritual Growth Workshop. And I think at the last one before they rebranded and renamed it, he taught a class. And the title of the class was Shakespeare in the Bible. And I thought, well, that one, that's kind of, I got to go check that out. And his thesis was, rather than comparing the Bible to Shakespeare, we need to be comparing Shakespeare to the Bible. And demonstrated throughout the class from various quotes and things that he worked into his writings that Shakespeare was intimately familiar with the Scriptures and incorporated principles and, in some cases, phrases and words straight from the Bible into his plays and the characters as he developed it. So the Bible is not like Shakespeare. Shakespeare, is like the Bible. And, of course, what we're reading about predates Shakespeare by, 1,000, 1,500 years, whatever. But we're going to, tonight when we get into chapter 14 and even a little bit at the end of chapter 13, we're going to start to see some of the kinds of things that we associate with tragic characters and character flaws and people acting like real people, responding to fears and responding to challenges and how they do that. But I'd also like to back up a little bit and catch up on 3 or 4 things. One is in chapter 10 and verse 6, and then again in verse 10, if you remember when Saul was anointed by Samuel, talks about the Spirit coming upon Saul. And we've talked about that and how he prophesied, and we're going to see this come up later in the story when the Spirit is taken away from him. And I just wanted to point out, we're not going to turn this into a class on the Holy Spirit, but the phraseology that's used here in the Old Testament, and I think with maybe one exception that I can't recall right now, every time the Holy Spirit is talked about in the Old Testament, associated with being with people, it's not the Spirit entered them. The Spirit was in them. It says that the Spirit comes upon them. And I think that's significant because we think about what the Spirit is doing and how God is working with Saul and through Saul. It's not the same thing, I don't believe, as the indwelling of the Holy Spirit. What we have is so much deeper and so much greater than that. And just notice that verbiage when you see the Spirit show up in the Old Testament. It's the Spirit came on them, as if it's an external sort of thing as opposed to an indwelling that we receive when we become Christians. Second thing is, stay there in chapter 10, 1 Samuel chapter 10. There was a little bit of confusion, and it is a little confusing about this Gilgal thing, and Saul being told to go down to Gilgal and to wait for Samuel. And I think Tyler pointed it out towards the end. In chapter 10, when Saul is anointed by Samuel, he's told all of these things that are going to happen. And you had a great discussion about how that made it clear that this was something that God was doing. And not only to demonstrate to the people, but to demonstrate to Saul that, yeah, it's really is happening. And so after those things, then it says, after that, you will go down to Gilgal, but you need to wait for me. Wait 7 days for me, okay? And Doesn't say how much long after that is. But when you read through, there's things that happen at Gilgal after that. That's where he's officially anointed before the people. But clear from the story that we read about in 13, and we'll look at it again in just a minute, is when Saul jumps the gun and offers sacrifices, doesn't wait for Samuel, that this is, in chapter 10, this is a reference about this event. And I think it has relevance, and I bring it up because it almost makes it that much more poignant or significant that Saul didn't wait. It's like, Saul, all of these things are going to happen. Okay? And I want to tell you this other thing. You're going to go down to Gilgal at some point, and you're going to need to wait for me. Okay? So it's like the first instruction that he's gotten as the anointed leader of Israel is, this is what you are to do. It's not just another one of these circumstances, things to convince you that God has really anointed you. It's something separate and more important than that. So that when Saul does go and starts getting nervous, and Samuel is not showing up, okay, and offers the sacrifices, it's even a bigger deal. It's like the one thing he was told at his anointing to do, and he fails at it. Talked a little bit last week also about, what was the problem with Saul offering sacrifices? And it was a good discussion. There were great points that were made about, being fearful, jumping the gun, trying to do things on your own power, all those things that we can relate to. But there was one other thing that wasn't mentioned that I think plays into this. And that is, Saul is offering sacrifices. Saul is a king. He's not a priest. How many priest kings are there in the Bible? Okay. Who are they? Melchizedek and Jesus. Okay. Saul, by taking on the role of a priest, he's stepping right into the middle of what God is doing in the long run in bringing the Messiah to us. And bringing a Messiah that's prophesied to be a priest and a king. And so for Saul to assume that, well, I'm in charge here, I can step in and do this, it's no big deal, it's like, it is a big deal. Without giving away too much of Chris's class, one of the whole points of Melchizedek being a priest and a king was he answers the question for those first century Jews that say, well, how can Jesus be a priest and a king and be from the tribe of Judah? Well, that guy Melchizedek, he wasn't from the tribe of Judah. And he was a priest and a king recognized by God. And Jesus, your Messiah, your high priest who sits at the right hand of God, he's a priest and a king. And so, again, for Saul to assume that role unwittingly and wrongly was a big deal. No. There's this principle, Chris, called spaced repetition. Okay? They won't remember. Okay? No. Yes, Jim.
I think it's either Uzziah or his father Amaziah. I think it's Uzziah, because we're reading in this, studying Isaiah, that basically does the same thing. He was a king, and he tries to offer a sacrifice. He has the censer in his hand, and God strikes him with leprosy at the time. Even though he was pretty much a good king, although it says he did not follow God wholeheartedly. But it does say he did what was right. But here's an example, like you're saying with the Shakespeare character. He was pretty good, but hey, he also did some dumb things.
And big deal for somebody to assume the role that they were not only a king, but that they were a priest. Couldn't do that. And what underscores how big a deal it is go to chapter 13. And again, you talked about this some last week. I guess if I get in Samuel instead of Judges, it'll work a little better. In chapter 13 and verse 13, let's back up to verse 11. Doesn't hurt to read this again. So Samuel arrives, and Saul goes out to greet him. Verse 11, "What have you done?" says Samuel. It'd be interesting to know the inflection that was there. "What have you done?" And Saul replied, "When I saw the men were scattering, and that you did not come at the set time, and the Philistines were assembling at Michmash, I thought, now the Philistines will come down against me at Gilgal, and I have not sought the Lord's favor. So I felt compelled to offer the burnt offering." I had to do it. And Samuel says, "You have acted foolishly. You've not kept the command the Lord your God gave you. If you had," this is interesting, and this is what I want to focus on. "If you had, he would have established your kingdom over Israel for all time." Now think about that phrase. You know, at the beginning of this class, we had a discussion, and Tim asked the question about, you know, what if Saul had done the right thing? What would have happened with the Messiah? Here, Samuel is saying that God was prepared to establish Saul's family, his kingdom over Israel for all time. I don't know the answer to the David question, other than I know that God was able to do what he had intended to do and bring us the Messiah through David's line, as was prophesied. But what I want you to see, and what I think is important, is that in any way you want to look at it, God did not half-step with Saul and with the Israelites in giving them a king. You know, I think we've talked every week about, you know, well, they asked for a king and he gave them a king. God gave him a king and gave him the support, gave him the help, gave him everything. So no Israelite could say, well, God, the problem was you just gave us the wrong guy. It's your fault. Nobody could do that. And nobody could point a finger at Samuel and say, well, Samuel, you just went and found somebody you knew would fail because you were mad that we didn't want you to lead us anymore. All the circumstances, all of the things that were prophesied that had to happen for Saul after Saul was anointed made it clear that any way that you want to look at it, God has not half-stepped. He hasn't given them a placeholder. Okay? I'll give you somebody I know is going to fail. Okay? And then I'll bring David in. Says he was prepared to establish it. I don't know what that means. And some folks have theorized various things about how it might happen, but again, you know, God's able to accomplish his purposes. I don't have any doubt about that. But understand that Saul is not being left, he wasn't hung out to dry. He wasn't set up to fail. He wasn't not given the resources that he needed to be successful. He, of his own volition, got scared and made the decision, you know, I'm going to lose all my men if I don't do something quick. I don't know where Samuel is. He ought to get here. So let's just offer these sacrifices. So let's go to verse 16. This last little section of 13 I don't think you covered last week, but I think it sets the table and gives us maybe a clearer understanding of the circumstances that Israel and Saul found themselves in against the Philistines. Let's just read beginning in verse 16. Saul and his son Jonathan and the men with them were staying in Gibeah in Benjamin while the Philistines camped at Michmash. Raiding parties went out from the Philistine camp in 3 detachments. One turned toward Ophrah in the vicinity of Shual, and another towards Beth-horon, and the third towards the borderland overlook. or the borderland overlooking the valley of Zeboim facing the desert. Not a blacksmith could be found in the whole land of Israel, because the Philistines had said otherwise, the Hebrews will make swords or spears. So all Israel went down to the Philistines to have their plowshares, mattocks, axes, and sickles sharpened. Price was 2/3 of a shekel for sharpening plowshares and mattocks, and 1/3 of a shekel for sharpening forks and axes and for repointing goads. So on the day of the battle, not a soldier with Saul and Jonathan had a sword or a spear in their hand. Only Saul and his son Jonathan had them. How bad was it for the Israelites with the Philistines? Okay. Well, okay. All right, we're going to read about, there are some Hebrews that the Philistines took that might have been their blacksmiths. I don't know how. I'd love to know how Saul and Jonathan got a sword. That doesn't say. I don't know how, but they were the only ones. Yeah, it could have been. You know, I just see this scene, from Frankenstein when the mobs, got their pitchforks and their, their axes and their farm tools and whatever. That's the Israelite army. That's what they had to go fight with. Meanwhile, the Philistines have thousands of iron chariots and horses. They have all the blacksmiths, all of the weapons. The places that are described where they were sending out raiding parties and the places where they had encampments watching over the Israelites, they're all high ground. They had the high ground. They had the strategic locations. And it was so bad, you read last week earlier in chapter 13, that an army of 300,000 Israelites, Saul, for whatever reason, reduced it to 3,000, and they start slinking off into the forest. We're going to lose. We're going to get our tails kicked. And they start deserting. And in that context, you have Saul getting scared. Samuel, where are you? Okay, we got to do something. God's going to have to deliver us, so somebody's got to do this sacrifice. One of the things that we'll see here and on into chapter 14 is that much of Saul's spirituality at this point is almost superstitious. Well, I know we've got to offer a sacrifice before we go to battle, so, Samuel's not here, so I'll do it because we've got to have it. Okay. Not so much because he was really crying out to the Lord. He may be crying out to the Lord in fear, but not so much because of his trust in contrast to his son Jonathan in the Lord's deliverance. And we're going to see later on in 14 that he does other things. And says other things, it's almost as if, like sometimes we feel, well, I go to church all the time, so God must be pleased with me. I had my quiet time this morning. I can't tell you what I studied, but I had it. Surely God checked that off for me. Just this, our religion or our spirituality is sort of a superstition as opposed to being from our heart. And so things are dire, okay? And we go to chapter 14 and we have a contrast. Jonathan has been mentioned a couple of times already, but now for the first time we see the character of Jonathan, beginning in verse 1. Now a detachment of Philistines had gone out to the pass at Michmash. One day Jonathan, son of Saul, said to the young man bearing his armor, "Come, let us go over to the Philistine outpost on the other side." But he didn't tell his father. Saul was staying on the outskirts of Gibeah under a pomegranate tree in Migron. With him were about 600 men, among whom was Ahijah, who was wearing an ephod. He was the son of Ichabod's brother, that guy, son of Phinehas, the son of Eli, the Lord's priest in Shiloh. No one was aware that Jonathan had left. Okay. There are a number of things in this paragraph of interest. Okay. So Jonathan is in a position of authority. He's out there. Where's his dad? Sitting under a tree. What's just happened to his dad? He got chewed out and told what? You're going to lose your kingdom. Bad things are going to happen. And he's looking around, and his soldiers are unarmed, ill-equipped, scared, slipping away. I don't know what kind of position Saul was sitting in under the tree, but it wouldn't be hard to imagine him sitting there with his head in his hand going, what am I going to do? Okay. Now Samuel is nowhere to be seen. Don't know where Samuel is. But who is there with him? No, Jonathan's left the camp. There's that guy with whose lineage I couldn't pronounce all the names. Okay, it's a priest with an ephod, a descendant of Eli. What's Eli known for? Bad kids. Okay. Not exactly the lineage of priests that you necessarily would want to grab, but again, I think along this lines that, Saul's spirituality was almost superstitious. Well, I got a priest here and he's got an ephod. What's an ephod? And what was an ephod used for? Chris.
Well, I think it was part of their uniform. They had a breastplate on them, and it had jewels set into it, and it was considered a way of contacting God.
Okay. Had two pockets. Remember what was in the pockets?
Yeah, I haven't studied it in a while, so you're going to have to fill us in on those details.
Okay.
But
two pockets and the Urim and the Thummim. Okay.
Yeah.
Remember the Urim and the Thummim? And they were used to cast lots for God to communicate. Okay. And so Saul's got this guy here. I can't have Samuel, so I'll get this guy, and maybe we'll get, maybe the Lord's going to come through, but, I don't know what we're going to do. I don't know how we can do this. Meanwhile, what's Jonathan doing?
He's checking out the competition. He's checking out the enemy.
Let's go over here.
He's being strategic.
Let's go see what's going on. Okay? Let's read a little further. On each side of the pass that Jonathan intended to cross to reach the Philistine outpost was a cliff. One was called Bozez and the other Sinai. One cliff stood to the north toward Michmash, the other to the south toward Geba. Jonathan said to his young armor-bearer, "Come, let's go over to the outpost of these uncircumcised fellows. Perhaps the Lord will act in our behalf. Nothing can hinder the Lord from saving, whether by many or by few. Do all you have in mind." The armor-bearer said, "Go ahead, I am with you, heart and soul." So what's Jonathan going to do? What's he doing?
pick a fight.
I'm going to, okay. With who? How does he describe them? Okay. These bunch of rubes, okay, these jerks, these guys who hate God, maybe God will help us. He doesn't need many. Jim.
Well, one thing, he sounds a lot like David when he went before Goliath.
Okay.
And two, this thing about the contrast with Saul, and where Samuel said God's going to choose someone who's after his own heart. this whole idea of being wholehearted and after God's own heart.
Okay.
Every time I see it in the Old Testament, it's connected to this belief that God can deliver, that they're not trusting in themselves or on superstition or something. They believe that God can deliver, like this Joshua and Caleb, the spies, you know. Yeah, it looks like it's, oh, woe is us.
Okay.
But they believe God can, and even Jonathan says right here, he talks about whether with a few or many, God can win the victory.
Okay. Well, let's think about this for a second. Isn't Saul waiting on the Lord? A phrase we throw out a lot of times. Well, I'm going to wait on the Lord. And isn't Jonathan maybe being rash and just assuming things?
I don't think so.
I don't either. But tell me why, Chris.
Because Saul's idea of waiting on the Lord is sitting under a tree and doing nothing.
Wringing his hands.
Wringing his hands. He should have waited on the Lord when the Lord said to wait. That would have been a proper action.
Good point.
But now he's just sitting on his hands. And I've read so many scriptures where somebody repented of their evil and God gave what they needed. I mean, Jonah with Nineveh was the primary example.
Okay.
He said, I'm going to wipe you out. You're going to be wiped off the face of the earth.
Okay.
And he didn't give them any message of repentance. He just said, I'm fixing to wipe you out. They repented, and God relented
Okay.
and gave them peace and didn't destroy them. And Jonathan is doing the very thing that David did. He says, I'm going to go out here, and it says, it may be that the Lord will work for us, for nothing can hinder the Lord from saving by many or by few. That's a completely different attitude than what Saul was exhibiting.
Okay.
And I think that is the attitude we should be exhibiting. I don't believe we should sit around and just do nothing and wait.
Okay.
We should get out there and be busy about the Lord's business and pray to the Lord that he will help us and guide us and move us where he needs to be. And, if God spoke to us and said, you need to wait until Samuel shows up, well, then that's what we should do. But a lot of times he doesn't communicate that clearly. He just says, go out and be powerful in my name and do what I said to do and love your neighbor and do these things. And
Okay.
if we would do that and trust God to prosper his kingdom, his work, I think we'd have a totally different outcome.
Okay. It's almost as if Saul is, I'm going to sit and I'm going to wait for somebody to show me that I should do something, as opposed to Jonathan, I'm going to put myself in position so that if the Lord's, this is what the Lord wants to do, I'm going to be there and it'll happen. He certainly can do it. And he goes on this, a lot of times we get hung up on the next verses about him asking for a sign, but it's, I think if the word had been or the circumstances had been such that he shouldn't go, he would have recognized it and he would have pulled back. But he was in position to do that.
He gave him two scenarios. He even talked to his armor bearer.
Yeah.
We're going to say to them, we're going to show ourselves to them, and if they come down to us, we're going to assume that means we need to just stand here or probably hide,
Right.
because God's not in here. But if they say come up to them, then we're going to take that as a sign from the Lord, and we're going to go up there.
Okay.
And that takes boldness. It takes faith to believe that God is going to be in that situation. And it's kind of like what Gideon did with the fleece. He said, Lord, let the fleece be wet and the ground be dry. And then he did it again. There was some doubt in there too. But at least Gideon was ready to go if he got enough information from God that, okay, this is the thing you want me to do. He went. And I believe that's what Jonathan's doing here.
Well, he's doing it, and his armor bearer says, I'm with you. Okay, I'm with you heart and soul. And certainly there's a lesson in a sermon there. But let's read the verses that Chris just talked about. Beginning in verse 8. Jonathan says, come then, we'll cross over toward the men and let them see us. If they say to us, wait there until we come to you, we'll stay where we are, not go up to them. But if they say, come up to us, we will climb up, because that will be our sign that the Lord has given them into our hands. Okay, now remember these guys, physically where these guys are. The Philistines have the high ground, and they have the weapons.
It says they had to climb up hand over hand to get to it.
Okay? You know, I don't know how the Philistines said, come on up. You know, I don't think it was, yeah, come on up, you know, we'll have a cup of coffee and we'll talk about things. Maybe we can come up with a treaty or whatever. I think it was more, all right, yeah, you just come on up here. Okay. And that saying, in that kind of tone of voice, Jonathan was saying, if we hear that, we're going to take it to them, which to me makes it even more, you know, even more bold. And so they go up. So both of them showed themselves, verse 11, at the Philistine outpost. Look, said the Philistines, the Hebrews are crawling out of the holes they were hiding in. And if you read back early in Samuel, they're hiding in the the wine presses. They're hiding in the trees. Things are so outnumbered for the Israelites. And the Philistines are the proverbial bully. You know, they're not just the, you know, we got all the stuff and you don't, and you know, you're just those poor little guys. I mean, they just abused them. Okay? Rubbed their noses in it. And so here they are. Here's two of these guys. Come on up here. Yeah. You showed us. You just come on up here. And so they do. So Jonathan climbed up using his hands, verse 13, and feet, with his armor bearer right behind him. And the Philistines fell before Jonathan and his armor bearer, followed and killed behind him. In that first attack, Jonathan and his armor bearer killed some 20 men in the area of about a half an acre. I would say God was with them. Okay? The next verse is interesting. Then panic struck the whole army. And those in the camp in the field, and those in the outposts and raiding parties, and the ground shook. It was a panic sent by God. Why did they panic? Okay, God sent the panic. Okay. Said the ground shook. But what had also just happened?
I mean, two people just, I mean, that's just that had to have been just unfathomable that the two people got past the first Philistine. I mean, these guys must have been like crazy. I mean, crazy like beyond human capability. And it was God, but it must have looked like Tasmanian devil coming through there. And they said and they were afraid there was a lot more of that behind them. Yeah. You know?
Okay, two guys come up, kill 20 guys, the ground shakes. Also, in the back of the minds of the Philistines, what might have been there? What had happened to them previously? Remember that story about the ark? Okay, where the Israelites were superstitious and brought the ark out with them to battle. God didn't want them to do that, so he abandoned them, and the Philistines got the ark. You remember how that story ended? It's like, it was so bad for them, they brought it back and said, here, you take it, we don't want it. Okay? I wonder if that didn't play in, oh no, this is happening again. And this is only two of these guys. What are they, and he had a sword. What in the world is going to happen, Chris?
Well, this is going to play out well for the Israelites, but the point I wanted to make here was how much victory and defeat and power is in the mind. Because, these two guys beat 20 guys, but then all of the rest of this stuff was unfolded because of panic, because of attitude, because God shook them. It was mental. I mean, they lost mentally a long time before they physically died.
Okay.
And that's the case with us. I mean, we see that all throughout history, is that most of our mistakes, how many of us self-sabotage ourselves because we get a bad idea or a bad attitude, or, we get afraid and we make stupid choices because we're in the wrong headspace. And this is just obviously God was heavily involved in this, but they lost the battle in their mind before they ever lost it with their sword.
Okay. Who won the battle? Okay, God did. But who won the battle? Saul? Did Saul win? Okay, I'm kind of giving away next week, but I think that, and we're gonna wrap up with this. But as this thing has unfolded, Saul, who's in charge, has been abandoned by Samuel. He's got a priest there with him. He's sitting under a tree wringing his hands, and his forces are melting away. His son, who trusts in the Lord, has engineered and brought about the victory that now is going to inspire the troops that are back over there with Saul to go out and to go after the Philistines and be able to defeat them. It's not by accident that we see this happening. There's no way that you can look at this and say, well, Saul has won a great victory. God must be with him. It's his son has engineered it and inspired it so that it happens. I think this is the beginning of, we always talk about the jealousy that Saul had towards David. I think there's jealousy that gets germinated here between Saul and his son. His son kind of shows him up here. Any other comments? We're going to leave the rest of this story for Tim next week. It's fascinating. There's so many layers to this, the characters and how God can work through any situation. In a hopeless situation of the Israelites against the Philistines, delivers them, turns around and does it again with David in a few chapters. Yeah, Chris? Yeah, wait for the mic. That's one of the things I learned last week watching online. Yes. You didn't get the microphone. We couldn't hear what you said.
Well, I just think it's fascinating when you read this history. This is different than any other history I've ever read. Secular historians, they cherry pick certain points to make they've got a theme in mind, and you can tell that they're trying to report history, but it's gonna have a bias. But this tells the good, bad, and the ugly. It doesn't sugarcoat it. It tells things that you wouldn't tell if you were a normal historian, like people normally do. The idea that history is written by the people who win. Okay. It's never written by the losers because they're gone, and the winners get to write it down the way they saw it. But this doesn't do that, and I think it's one of the strongest evidences for the validity of the Scriptures. Yeah. And this all the way through 1st, 2nd Samuel, Kings, Chronicles. You see this kind of writing all the way through the history of the Jews. But when you read Josephus and the histories of the Jews through Josephus' eyes, you see a different flavor of the way it's reported, because he was loyal to the Jews and trying to make a point. And he does a pretty good job of bringing up, what happened in detail. But I just feel when I read this, I just get a different flavor for how it comes across.
One of the things that you see in the scriptures is you see God taking Israel from slavery in Egypt all the way through to the promised land and all that they went through. And then all the way through these are people that for generations had lived as slaves. They didn't know how to rule themselves. They didn't know how to be a nation. There were so many things they just didn't know how to do. And yet we see from Exodus all the way up through Kings and Chronicles and even on into the prophets, how God is preparing his people and the world for the Messiah. And he brings them through all of that and shows how that even with the best kings, the strongest armies, the most strategic locations, all of the wealth, the best laws, and the God who is, that we still needed a Messiah. And so you look at that and you go, well, why did God do all this? Why didn't he just send the Messiah, the end of Genesis and be done with it? It's like he's preparing it all. And it's all a tremendous story and lessons for us about God's care and concern for us and his planning and the wisdom and all that he put together. Let's close out with a prayer. God, we thank you for your word. We thank you for the depth of it. We thank you for the encouragement that we get from it. We thank you for what we learn about you and your nature and your love for us. Pray that you will bless this study as it continues on. Thank you for Tim and the lessons that he's bringing us. Help us to understand that not only ourselves, but everyone that we come in contact with is not just a one-dimensional person, but that we have fears, we have desires, we have ambitions, feelings, just all kinds of things. And God, you have created us, and you've created us in a wondrous way. And you've provided for us, and you've provided a high priest for us who sits at your right hand, who is a priest and a king. And we can come and we can lay our cares before you. We can trust in you. Pray that you'll help us to be more like Jonathan and less like Saul. And pray that you'll be with us as we go now. Bless us for good rest tonight. Be with, there's just a long list of folks that need your healing, need your strengthening. And just pray that you will be with them among our number here. And we pray this in your Son's name. Amen.
Thank you for